Good everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Been a little while between these videos. I've been overseas exploring a bit of Korea, but come back straight into some new economic data on the economy. Gareth, we've had the latest labour market statistics out for the first 3 months of 2025, showing the unemployment rate stable at 5.1%, still at a higher rate than where we've seen it the last couple of years, not nearly as bad as where we got through the likes of the global financial crisis and similar, but also not really no increase in the headline figure, at least in the March quarter. We had been expecting, markets have been picking anywhere from a 5.2 to 5.3% rate, so a little bit of a lift. Actually, that number came out fairly flat, but there were a number of other moves in there, the likes of the underutilization rate rising further, a bit more of a focus on part-time work, it looks like. I mean, what's been driving that unemployment rate, both going up, but also what kept it a bit more stable this time? Because there do look like there's quite a lot of movements of people below the surface that are sort of changing the labour market, even though the headline levels might not be shifting as much.
Yeah, you mentioned that underutilization, and it is reflected, I think, in terms of people wanting to work and wanting to work more hours, but that work not necessarily being available, and that sort of shift from full-time to part-time work, not necessarily in the same roles or the same industries. It's quite hard to get really into the detail on that, but my suspicion is that when you sort of delve into those numbers a bit more, probably what you're getting is some people losing their jobs and then having to go and pick up part-time work elsewhere, to make ends meet and to sort of cover their household costs and that type of thing. So there is still the sort of a bit of churn and dynamism going on. Job numbers were up a little bit from the previous quarter, but they're still sitting down 0.7% from where they were this time last year. So still a level of weakness there. And really, I think the main reason the unemployment rate didn't go up as expected was the fact that there's just fewer people participating in the labour force. So there is that element of, as the labour market softens and the economy is weak, people do become more discouraged and therefore just can't be bothered looking for work because they feel like there's not much out there, or perhaps they move off into training and education, taking the opportunity to upskill because their life circumstances, the job situation has changed, and so those people typically drop out of the labour force as that occurs, and therefore it just means that rather than them looking like they're unemployed, they're not working, but they're not looking unemployed either because they don't meet the sort of official criteria that we have in place for counting them as being unemployed. So that's probably the dynamic there. But I mean, overall, when you look at those numbers, it does suggest that they are consistent with our previous thinking that the labour market getting close to a turning point and expectations, I think probably for the last 12 to 18 months had been that mid-2025 might be when things sort of bottom out and start to improve there. And I think, generally speaking, we still remain on track for that. I mean, the latest numbers, if anything, probably slightly towards the better end of expectations, and that does end up being encouraging. I mean, of course, the other thing that we have seen with the labour market softening is it has fed through into slower labour cost growth as well. So there's less pressure on businesses in terms of having to bring in workers and having to try and retain workers as well from a financial point of view. And I think so total labour cost growth slipping below 3%. But there is quite a dichotomy there still between the private sector, much more open to those market forces, whereas in the public sector, labour cost inflation or labour cost growth still running at over 4%. So still a bit of a mixed bag when we look at those numbers.
And again, I mean, all of these different changes, both on the sort of the labour market side directly, but also looking at those labour costs that are slowing back. I mean, I think the headline labour cost index down, or sort of still up, but slowing back to, I think, 2.9% previously, well above 3%. So, that little bit of a slowdown that's coming through, like you say, indicative of where the economy's shifting. I was also interested at the number of hours worked in the economy continuing to pull back on the various measures that we have. Again, reflective of what you were talking about there in terms of the part-time work and similar that's been emerging where, look, from a business point of view, you still want to try and have workers, you're still trying to keep things moving, but you're just simply not able to offer as many hours because there's not as much work to be done. And I think all of that as well gels in with the other sort of indicators that we have in the labour market space. The number of job ads and similar, again, at a low position, but broadly stable the last couple of months, starting to track sideways. Some of the monthly jobs data, again, starting to show a few sort of greenish shoots every now and then, a few sort of of pips upwards every now and then, but not big shifts, which I think is consistent with that evolution that we're seeing in the jobs market there. It's clearly tough out there, but as you say, a few more people becoming discouraged, but also a few more getting into some forms of work, but not necessarily quite as much. I mean, looking forward for the Reserve Bank, an unemployment rate of 5.1%, all else being equal, they might look at that and go, well, geez, it's not quite as bad as we were thinking it was going to be. There might not be quite as much slack in the labour market, but realistically, with that change in the participation rate, and probably more importantly, the fact that those labour cost increases are slowing back, they'll broadly be comfortable enough, I think, with all of the data that's coming out that, again, yes, they'll be able to cut interest rates a little bit more, but there's no need to either stop or to go on even more of a tear. It's a little bit of more stay the course, I would have thought.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't think it changes their view, particularly on where things go to from here. And let's be honest, in terms of the way the sort of global economic position is unfolding at the moment, there's probably bigger fish to fry for them. This reinforces the perception and the understanding that the New Zealand economy has some spare capacity in it. We think the unemployment rate could get back down to 4% before you start to really hit inflationary pressures and inflationary concerns. So a little bit more stimulus, a little bit more support probably doesn't go amiss at the moment, but it's not like they need to necessarily be slashing interest rates in response to the numbers that we've seen here. I mean, I think for me, probably the biggest question going forward is maybe not so much a monetary policy one at this stage, but how much does that labour market start to turn around in the second half of this year and into 2026? Previously, we've been looking at the economic recovery and going, okay, export prices are looking fantastic for most of our exports. We've got interest rates coming down, and that obviously provides support in terms of domestic spending activity and demand levels as well. But now, when you overlay that with the global economic situation and the uncertainty there, it may well be that later this year that we don't see employment necessarily picking up with the sort of same speed that we had previously been thinking, because realistically, businesses, given the uncertain economic environment, they are going to be holding back in terms of their investment and hiring decisions. So I'm not saying there won't be jobs growth coming through, and you've talked about a few greener shoots coming through, which are encouraging in some specific industries, but I do just see there's risks there, I think, as we look into later this year in 2026, that sort of recovery is just a bit stunted in terms of the labour market, which of course we know that households are still under financial pressure in terms of various aspects of cost of living. And if you overlay that with just a little bit of more softness or slower recovery in the labour market, again, just makes me a little bit cautious around expectations for that recovery in household spending overall going forward. So it'll be interesting to see how those numbers unfold later in 2025.
And as well as that, I mean, the government, of course, with the budget coming up, compared to where budget 2024 came through, the number of people on a job seeker benefit, which is not directly one-to-one with unemployment, but they do very much often move in a similar direction. The forecast from budget 2024 compared to actual's been a whole lot worse. There's been more people on various job seeker and other benefits, and so again, sort of a fiscal cost there at a time when government doesn't have nearly as much room to manoeuvre. So there's implications, all the way from households specifically, whether or not they've got a job and how many hours they're getting, what they can afford to pay for, all the way through to what happens to interest rate setting and sort of fiscal settings as well, let alone that wider challenging global picture. We'll assess all of that, including where the labour market heads next, on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.